Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Daniel. I'm the chaplain at St Paul's Grammar School, and it's my pleasure to be able to open up God's Word with you this morning. I got to preach a couple of weeks ago and spoke about surviving as a Christian in a non-Christian world, and talked a bit about the different postures we might take. And I thought today was I got another gig, so I thought it was a good opportunity to expand on that thinking a little bit, but focus less on how we survive and more on what we have as Christians to offer to a non-Christian world. Now, I know it's school holidays, so we can't have the brains of our young people turning off completely. So for our older kids and teenagers, a little challenge for you during the sermon, because this is a dense sermon. There's a lot in it, and we're going to move fast. So to help you stay with me, A, we'll have some pictures, and that helps everyone. But B, teens, older kids, I'm going to give you 4 things. This is like a mini sermon bingo. And at the end of the service, I want you to tell me what I said about each of these things. A dog, a grandmother, a giant, and Luke Skywalker. Got that? A dog, a grandmother, a giant, and Luke Skywalker. There's your challenge. 4 things at the end of the service. Come and tell me. The first one's going to be pretty easy because we're going to start with it. Some of you may have met our second golden retriever. This one's our puppy. His name is Whiskey. Whiskey's almost 8 months old now, and he's just reached what is known as the adolescent fear period. If you have raised dogs before, you might be familiar with this. Basically, our very relaxed and easygoing puppy woke up one morning, looked around, and thought, my goodness, the world is a scary place. And so now, instead of being all relaxed about things, while he works through this phase, we have to help this poor spooked dog deal with scary things like parked cars and people with bags or piles of large plastic containers. All these things have spooked him so far. It's quite funny and a little bit frustrating, and it's all very well to laugh at our puppy, but sometimes it can feel like the same thing is happening to us. We've had a similar experience. Like we woke up one morning and the world just got really complicated and confusing. Maybe not overnight, but far quicker than we were expecting. I was down the street the other day, and the grandmother of a student at St Paul's where I teach stopped for a chat. And she, just in general conversation, she was expressing great bafflement at the things her grandson would come home and talk about as being normal. And she cited things like the prevalence of self-harm amongst girls, and she expressed complete bafflement about the way young people talk about gender identity. Now, there was no judgment in her comments. It was simply the struggle of an intelligent woman trying to make sense of a world that seemed to her to have changed overnight. I was very sympathetic to her struggles. When I did speak a couple of weeks ago, I spoke drawing heavily on the book by Steve McAlpine, Being the Bad Guys. That was my book recommendation for last time. And we looked at how Christianity has moved rapidly from being the cultural norm to being viewed as a potentially harmful worldview. We considered the various postures we can take in response to that. There was cloistering, hiding away. There was combat, we're up for the fight. Or there was Jesus' model of compassion. Now, you'll hear some of those themes coming through today, but I want to hone in a little bit more on what I think is some of the demonstrably unhelpful things about post-Christian culture, and more importantly, what do we as Christians have to offer as an alternative? And to do this, I want to use a comparison of 2 of Israel's most notable kings, which is why we had those strange collection of readings from 1 Samuel and then the Psalm, and we're going to come back on all of those and hopefully make them make a bit more sense. The ideal, I said to Scott when he was preparing for this, the ideal preparation for this service would have been to have everyone read the whole of 1 Samuel. I thought that was ambitious for a morning, so I've done that, and I'm going to try and draw out some themes for you. But before we get to the kings, let's identify some of the problems, because let's face it, the brave new secular world is not quite working out as wonderfully as some may have hoped. Think about the growing mental health crisis amongst young people, increasing polarisation of people around a multitude of issues, and the corresponding breakdown of public debate. It won't come as a surprise to anyone, I wouldn't think, that the top 3 issues concerning young Australians when they were surveyed last year were, number one, the environment, number two, equity and discrimination, and number three, mental health. They're the top three things that concern young people and probably many of us in the world today. There's a lot that's going wrong. So what exactly is going on here? What's the dynamic and what do we have to offer? Now, to diagnose the problem, I'm going to draw on the work of social psychologist Jonathan Haidt. Now, Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian, so he's looking and diagnosing the secular world from a secular viewpoint. And he's written some interesting stuff in a book co-written with the journalist Greg Lukianoff called The Coddling of the American Mind. This is probably my second book recommendation. Haidt suggests that in perpetuating what he calls three great untruths, which are hindering healthy discourse and understanding, we're doing ourselves great harm. The three untruths, he says, can be summarised by three statements. Now, see if these resonate with you, either positively or negatively. But these are the three statements that he suggests. Firstly, the first untruth, that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. The untruth of fragility. I'll come back to each of these individually, but here they are. The second one, always trust your feelings. And thirdly, life is a battle between good people and evil people. So he says these are the things that we're trying to, that popular culture is trying to tell our young people and all of us that are actually unhelpful. So this is the secular diagnosis of what's going wrong. So let's look at them one at a time, see what he's talking about, and what we as Christians might speak into this. So the first untruth, the untruth of fragility. It centres around the idea that people are inherently fragile and need protection from discomforting ideas. We touched on this a little bit last time. He claims that our well-intentioned desires to shield particularly young people from the possible trauma of confronting challenging topics actually risk causing them more harm. He's not talking about physical safety. He's very supportive of making sure we're all physically safe. But when it comes to wrestling with ideas, he says we've overdone the safety thing. This is how he puts it in his words. By overprotecting our children, we're setting them up to be weak, to be more easily damaged, to be more easily discouraged. The first step in equipping a young person to engage in healthy, robust and respectful conversation is to expose them to ideas that may challenge them, opinions that they might disagree with, and to help them see that wrestling with these ideas will strengthen, not harm them. So you can see probably the way this is reflected in our society, that ideas are harmful and we have to be protected from them, and that comes back to that idea of if it doesn't kill us, it'll make us weaker, so we must steer clear of them. Now, there's a whole lot of ways we could unpack that, but let's be honest, new ideas, it's not just young people, new ideas, especially ones that challenge our worldview, can be scary. We all know that. It's not just true for young people. Things like, you might have found the issues around climate change, the rise of AI technology, that's scary, wars, radical ideologies. There's plenty in the world to fear if we want to take that posture. And the secular response to that is to shield ourselves from anything scary because discomfort might harm us. So we don't want to face it. We must stay safe from it. So we draw our little boundaries around ourselves. Because remember, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. That's the kind of pool we're swimming in. They're the messages that we're getting. Now, Haidt's talking to a particular sort of environment, but I think it holds true for broader society in a lot of ways. So what is it? What alternative do Christians offer? In a pluralistic society full of these confronting, challenging worldviews, what do Christians have to offer? Well, let's play our first round of Compare the Kings. In our first reading, you heard the beginnings of the very well-known story of David and Goliath. Now, I'm assuming that most of us know how it ends, so I didn't worry about giving you the full story. Spoiler alert, David kills Goliath. But I know I've spoiled it for some of you, but what I was more interested in was the way our two kings, the reigning King Saul and future King David, respond to a threat. Now, in this case, the threat is a physical threat in some instances. So we've got the champion named Goliath. He's a giant of a man. And he comes out, he's 6 cubits and his height was 6 cubits and a span. I don't know how tall 6 cubits and a span is, but I assume it's pretty big. Pip's going to work it out for me. Excellent. He's got his full armour on and he's out there challenging. So Goliath appears, he's shouting threats and abuse, challenges the Israelites to a duel. Send out your best fighter, see if they can defeat me. So how does King Saul respond, our first king? Well, you saw it, you heard it in the reading. On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. That's the response of the king and the people. They were dismayed and terrified. Now, granted here, the threat here was a threat to physical safety, but being conquered by the Philistines also represented an end to the Israelites' way of life as God's chosen people. So this was both a physical and an existential threat to them. And the response is one that we're very familiar with today: fear and dismay. They were frightened and terrified. What did they do? I'm not really sure. I imagine them scurrying around in a panic, lots of people advising Saul about the best way to retreat, but no one seemed to know what to do. Compare that with David. Now, David's not yet the king. He's only a shepherd boy. How does he respond when he encounters the same threat? We read, and we might even be able to put it up there. There we go. It's very small, you probably can't read it, but you've heard it already. David said to Saul, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. And when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it." He says, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he's defied the armies of the living God." And get the last bit. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." David is not driven by fear. He's able to draw on two very important things. Firstly, his own experience in surviving hardships and challenges already. And more importantly, the understanding that God was beside him through that. David knew, even as a young boy, what it was to face challenges. And in fact, he understood that those very challenges had prepared him for this one. And he also understood that it was not simply in his own strength that he was drawing confidence, but in the knowledge that God had rescued him before and could do so again. Saul is terrified and dismayed. David is confident and trusting in God and on his past experience. And I think as Christians, we can draw the same confidence for the challenges that we face. Whether it's navigating the complexities of AI, the confusion of gender and identity politics, or any other modern challenge, we can be confident, as David was, that God will be with us and that the challenges we face are preparing us for further challenges as we go. So there's Hyde's first great untruth. Let's move on to the second one. Always trust your feelings. If any kids have dozed off, there's your Luke Skywalker reference. Hyde argues that what we've done is we've elevated how we feel to an unjustified level of authority. If we feel something is true, then it must be true. I'm sure you've encountered this. Feelings now equate to facts, completely ignoring the fact that feelings are subject to hundreds of cognitive biases that plague human thinking. But you hear the message everywhere. Think about how often our heroes of stage and screen are encouraged to trust their heart or follow their gut or trust their feelings and instincts. You can list dozens of them. That's how we're told to operate. Compare that with our two kings. Let's play round 2 of Compare the Kings and see what happens when Saul... Now, if you haven't picked up the pattern here, Saul kind of models for us the unhelpful modelling of untruth, and David is going to give us the better model, but not the best. So what happens when Saul trusts his feelings? Well, by the time we got to the second reading, and here I need to give you the sort of 1 Samuel overview, not in full, don't worry. But by this stage, by the time we got to the second reading, things had got pretty tense between Saul and David. Saul is still the king, and he's driven by this insecurity. He's convinced that David is out to kill him and usurp his throne. Now, we know the backstory that David is going to become king and that God has ordained that, but David is not chasing it. David, on the other hand, refuses to raise a hand against Saul and is busy trying to avoid being killed by Saul himself. And you see it happen over and over again. But listen to what happens. So that's the story, that Saul is paranoid about David and is chasing him. David is trying to avoid being killed and refuses to raise a hand against Saul. Saul trusts his feelings. Now this is again, it'll be too small for you to read, and it's not even going to click. There we go. This is what happens. Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. Saul was seated spear in hand under the tamarisk tree with all his officials standing at his side. And he said to them, "Listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? Is that why you have conspired against me? No one tells me my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me, as he does today." Incited my servant to lie in wait for me. Saul was chasing David. David is trying to hide from Saul, and Saul is saying, "Why have you set me up like this?" Now, a few brave souls tried to reason with Saul to clarify the facts, but Saul doesn't want to hear it. He says again, and you can hear the same thing, "Saul said, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he's rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today?" Saul is paranoid. He's convinced that David is lying wait to kill him, despite all evidence to the contrary. Now, the priest in question who's in trouble here, Ahimelech, is pleading. He pleads to say, "Look, Saul, you know, when have I ever done anything against you?" And he pleads, and this is Saul's emotional response, and it's not a nice one. Then the king ordered the guards at his side, "Turn and kill the priest of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me." He's having a go at everyone, and he's got himself to the point where he's declared, "Kill the priests, because they're clearly against me too." So now we know this was unreasonable because it tells us, so unreasonable was this command that the king's officials wouldn't carry it out. They wouldn't do it. Saul's saying, "Kill them all." And they're saying, "Oh, now be reasonable, Saul, come on." Now, sadly, there's always someone willing to do the dirty work for the right price. And so, in this case, Doeg the Edomite does the job for Saul, and the priests and all their families are killed. Why? Because Saul trusted his feelings and got caught up in his paranoia. Now, feelings aren't always accurate. So what's wrong with always following your feelings? Feelings aren't always bad. Emotions are an intrinsic and wonderful part of being human. And so Hyde's not suggesting that all emotions should be ignored. From a Christian perspective, we only need to look at all of the Psalms to see the full range of emotion being expressed. We see anger, fear, joy, love, anxiety, depression, it's all there. Humans are created as emotional beings. That's who we are. The danger lies in giving too much weight or putting too much trust in our emotions, because we're just too adept at things like confirmation bias. The great untruth is that we should always trust our feelings, but the counter for this is not that we should never trust our feelings. The end goal is not to suppress or crush or even invalidate the things we feel. Instead, we offer a countercultural message that our feelings do not need to rule us, and in fact, we might sometimes be deceived by them. Compare Saul's actions with the way David speaks in the words of the psalm that we read together. Now, David has plenty of emotion going on, and this is towards the end of the psalm. I'm going to put some of it up there maybe. He says, there we go. "If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those in rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies." There's plenty of emotion there. David is feeling it. But he doesn't stop there or simply act on those emotions. David is willing to interrogate his own feelings, and better still, he invites God to interrogate them as well. And he finishes with those words, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts." See if there is any offensive way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. In a world where feelings rule supreme and any challenge to my truth is seen as an assault to my identity, it's perhaps ironic that Christians who have often been accused of irrational blind faith bring a model of calm, clear reasoning. If our antidote to fear is trust in God, then the antidote to being enslaved by our emotions is humility and prayer. That's two great untruths. We come to our third one, our last one. This is Height's third great untruth. He says this is the most insidious and damaging. It's that life is a battle between good people and evil people. Now, I remember as a child, there was a very simple formula that went with most of our imaginative play. The setting might vary from imaginary space battles to medieval jousting, but the basic template was summed up in the declaration, you be the goodie, I'll be the baddie. Now, life was divided up into good people and bad people, and we had absolute clarity about who was playing which role. Now, that's perfectly normal behaviour for children. A game of tag gets very confusing when no one knows who's it. A ball game falls apart when players aren't clear which team they're playing for. And then separating ourselves into clear groups or tribes becomes both a practical necessity and, increasingly, as we navigate through adolescence into adulthood, a social necessity. We're drawn to people with similar interests, with similar ideals, beliefs and values. We identify ourselves with those people. We join groups to participate in common activity. We find ourselves in tribes. That's natural and it can be a good thing. It provides connection, a sense of belonging, a shared purpose. The problem is not tribalism itself, but the way our tribes are formed and how they operate. Psychologist Elizabeth Siegel puts it this way. She says, we're built to be tribal, but sometimes that tribalism goes too far. The worst type of tribalism is groups aligned to destroy other groups, such as through ethnic cleansing and genocide. And we've heard the word tribalism used a lot today in reference to our politics. Today in our political world, we have bad tribalism, she says. Bad tribalism is a group identity that fosters the bullying and scapegoating of others not like you. Bad tribalism joins people out of anger, jealousy and spite, not for collective well-being. Now, we see bad tribalism at play not just in our politics, but in our general discourse and some of our social interactions. There's no doubt that social media encourages and perpetuates this kind of thinking and behaviour, drawing people together not for common good, but out of anger and a desire to take the others down. And the more narrowly we define our tribal identities around specific issues or features, the more heavily we police those boundaries, the more negative our interactions become. And so you have cancel culture and Twitter mobs are a natural outworking of this. Life is divided up into good people and evil people, where good is defined as anyone in total agreement with us, and evil is defined as anyone who disagrees. And so you may find yourself one day suddenly in total agreement with your tribe on 9 out of 10 issues, but should you step out of line on even just that one thing, you find yourself living out a scene from Survivor as the tribe tallies the votes and announces the tribe has spoken, and with a dramatic musical flourish snuffs out your torch and they say it's time to go. So the great untruth has been perpetuated once again. Good has triumphed and evil, in this case you, with your willful rebellion, has been vanquished. It's how we operate. If only it was so simple, says Lukanoff, the co-writer of that book. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But, and here he quotes Solzhenitsyn, but the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. Life is not a battle between good people and evil people. Rather, life is a complex set of interactions between people simultaneously capable of great good and unspeakable evil. Sometimes we will disagree with the best of intentions, and other times we will argue with the most selfish of motives. Now, here is where comparing the kings gets interesting. Saul started out as a very promising king. He was humble and gracious, but very soon fell victim to pride and arrogance. David is known as a king after God's own heart, and yet we know him to be guilty of some heinous crimes. Read the story of Bathsheba if you're not familiar with it. 2 kings, complicated people, not good and evil, but complex. Jesus was aware of tribal differences. There were plenty that plagued his world. It's not a new thing. Here's a short list of tribal tensions that we come across just in the New Testament. We've got Jews versus Romans, Samaritans versus Jews, Jews versus Greek, Greek Jews versus Hebrew Jews, clean Jews versus unclean Jews, Pharisees versus Sadducees, rich versus poor, men versus women. There were plenty of tribes going on. Jesus was aware of them, but he was also famous for his cross-tribal love. In every single situation where he's confronted with a tribal barrier, he crosses it. He absolutely refuses to get caught up in his own tribe's tribalism. Jews are better, purer, whatever. Nor will he be caught up in other tribal narratives. His love is relentless across all barriers. Now, I called this sermon 2 Kings and 3 Great Untruths, but perhaps I should have made it 3 Kings. Because in Saul, we see a failure driven by fear, pride, and irrational thinking that viewed people as either 100% for him or 100% against him. Basically, a model of the 3 great untruths. And in David, for all his flaws, we see a willingness to trust God and to submit his own emotions to prayerful interrogation. But neither of them is perfect. In King Jesus, we have a perfect model. Jesus did not shy away from challenge and suffering, but he faced it with complete trust in his Father. Jesus experienced the full gamut of human emotion, but was never ruled by them. Jesus can and should be our model for the way in which we engage with each other and live our lives in this secular world. And he is the thing that we have to offer as a hope for those that are suffering in this world. Lives marked by confidence and trust in God, who is greater than any fear. Lives marked by humility of heart and mind and a firm grasp on the knowledge that while we're fallen people, we are by God's grace also a saved people. And so we can join with David and we can pray just as he did in the psalm. Search us, God, and know our hearts. Test us and know our anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in us and lead us in the way everlasting. I hope that's been an encouragement to you. I know it was pretty dense, and I can certainly give you some recommended reading if you want to pursue any of those ideas. I look forward to hearing how you went with our 4 things: a dog, our grandmother, our giant, and Luke Skywalker. I'm getting a few nods, so I think I'll get some good reports, and I'll hand back over to Scott for now.